Thanks for being so understanding of our fun seating speakers. So are there any questions to start off?
This is for Ann from Crescent Butte. On your the peanut project, you guys said you moved 60,000 tons of waste. Where'd you guys move it to? Or did you encapsulate it right there?
If we actually, this would probably be a better question, maybe for Steve. Well, Steve's not here. Maybe Tara. Yeah, Tara can answer that. Tara's with DRMS.
Oh, I don't need the microphone. I talk too loud. So the mine waste at the peanut mine, as Ann told you, was a mixture of silver, mill tailings, and coal mine refuse. And Steve Renner, the project manager, did some testing of the materials and determined that there was in the coal refuse a neutralization potential that they were actually able to mix at a specific ratio, and I don't know that ratio offhand, but they were able to actually mix the coal refuse with the silver mill tailings to create basically an inert material. So you had a low pH material and a high pH material that basically neutralized and demobilized the metals. And then from there, they graded that into the site and then put a soil cap over it. And it's worked very, very well. There's not really any metals leaching out of those materials. And we also used that geomorphic reclamation design to, handle the surface water. I'm not going to go into that, but it basically keeps the water from really infiltrating in as much, and it manages the surface water so you don't have metals coming out anyhow.
And then we also kept a little, as I mentioned, as a historic artifact. There's some coal piles still just south of the site.
Thank you. This is for Trevor. On one of your slides, you have the term sinuosity. What does sinuosity mean? To me, it means stringy, but I don't know what it means in geologic or hydrologic terms.
Sure. The way that we define sinuosity is stream length divided by valley length. So most recently, what we actually do is we take a 250-meter stretch of stream. Well, a 250 diameter buffer zone is really what it is. We measure the stream remotely using basically GIS techniques. We measure the stream length and then we divide that by the length from the beginning of that stream reach to the end of it. And then that produces a value. Usually it's somewhere between like 1.1 and 1. I think I had one as high as 1.8. And for that stream, I think it's supposed to be meaning in terms of a Roskin stream classification scheme, it's supposed to be somewhere in the above 1.2.
So it's a measure of how twisty and curvy the stream is. Yeah, in a certain distance. So the more bends and sinuosity you have, you'll have a greater length of stream and a smaller reach.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Is that good or is that bad? You want sinuosity or you don't want it?
It depends on the stream. I probably let you talk about this, but in some cases, braided streams move a lot more sediment, and they need to be that way in a certain area. In other cases, where you have a meandering stream, or depending on whether the stream is gaining or I'll let you answer this.
Like Liz just said, yeah, it depends on the stream, it depends on the location of the stream. In the case of Kerber Creek, we do want a pretty high sinuosity. It has to do with recharging the floodplain and just kind of the stream type and the geology of the area. Back east, a lot of people talk about the importance of braided streams, so kind of what was just discussed too, the idea of moving more sediment load, just kind of the geology and the erodibility of the area.
think this was, it might have been yours, Trevor, or Rory maybe. On one of your slides you had caldera and you had resurgent dome. What is a resurgent dome?
These calderas, if you think of the volcano, think of like the analogy that's useful is a piston going up and down in an engine block. So as the magma swells in underneath and that piston comes up in a period of volcanism, when you get a lot of activity and lava flows and all the andesite volcanoes are erupting, the ground is all swollen up and that piston is up near the top. Well, then there's a period of acquiescence where the magma withdraws from below, and so you tend to get a collapse or a sinking effect of this whole volcanic caldera. So the piston drops down, and that's where you get the ring fractures, and the whole mass settles back into the ground. So a resurgent one is when you get the next pulse of volcanism that occurs along that same area, the piston comes back up again, causes more fracturing in the country rock, but you get a resurgence of that volcanic dome and it settle back down. I have a question actually for Rory, because I've worked on the Commodore mine for years. And this is all very interesting. This when we started learning about how old this groundwater is coming into the bottom of the mine, it's really fascinating to think, in terms of thousands of years. But like you said, the $1 million question is 169 pounds per day of zinc. Do we think that water is coming up clean and picking all that load up as it moves through the mine workings? Or what is your gut reaction on where are those levels of contaminants coming from? Could it be in the older groundwater itself?
And yes, that is the $1 million question. So one thing I tried to briefly mention is that the map, the old hand-drawn map, and you looked at those, there's a couple of workings that penetrate hundreds of feet down below this Nelson level. And from some of the information in the mining documents, it suggests that part of the reason they abandoned those areas is because the quality of the ore, the grade of the ore decreased significantly as they went down. So that's one insight to saying that if the water's coming through there, it may actually be of better quality because less, lower grade ore can kind of, in basic terms, relate to less mineralization and less kind of chemical interactions potentially happening. And then the other thing that, we have to think about is the fact that the production of acid mine drainage, there's also a lot related to how much oxygen is getting exposed. So you have three components when you're producing acid mine drainage. You have the water, you have the air, and then you have the parent material, the rock that it's happening to. So in some respect, generally you would tend to see an increase in the loads of the metals as you come out towards the exit because you're going to have more oxygen getting into that area, and you're going to be speeding up the chemical processes basically that create acidity and allow those metals to come into solution. So the metals are always going to be in the rock. Is there a ton of that metal in the rock down below? Probably, but whether or not it's mobile is the real question. Because if it doesn't get mobilized, that's okay. I mean, these contaminants don't become an issue until they're in a mobile state, right? And so they move out of the mine, they move downstream, they affect surface ecosystems. Below ground, it doesn't really affect these systems too much until it comes out.
Do you guys have any plans to try to answer the $1 million question, to try to get a sample of this deep older water before it enters the workings? How would that be done?
So basically, with a really good understanding of the geology, and I talked about these main faults and the spiral fracturing that comes off of them, and you combine that with historic information about where water came into the mines when they were doing the work. There's all kinds of notes that say when we reach 9,826 feet back into the mine, we started getting, X amount of water coming from the north, the toe slope, the header of the fault, from different areas. So that's, all of that information together combined with the geochemical analysis gives you an idea of if you were to drill a well from up above, where would you try to target? You want to try to target an area that you think is a viable flow path to be moving this water. So if you hit that, then you can pull it out. But as of right now, we're of course limited to where we can sample. And so adding these domestic wells that go into the ground, that's starting to tell us information. The well that we sampled recently between the two faults is roughly the same elevation, the water table that we hit in there, but it's not the same water. It's 200 years old, not 10,000 years old. And it has a different chemical composition. So that starts to tell you a little bit more about local scale recharge and the water recharging that versus in the deeper workings. So potentially you would target an area, you're trying to get an area you can pull the water out, but the bigger question is who's pulling the trigger, and what is the folks have to spend the money on it. And right now it's really interesting because of the chances of mining potentially happening again on the other side, on the Bulldog. If they were to start dewatering, for example, and their mine water discharge is low quality, they would probably, one of the options would be to build a treatment plant to treat that water before they put it back into the creek, right? So one thing that I was just told by Mike Wireman is that there's potential efforts to be made between the state and the EPA and the mining company in terms of long-term solutions. If we can't go at this targeting approach because of financial restrictions, which at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to a lot of times, is if they were to build a plant, would that dry, if they pump down the Bulldog, does the Nelson dry up? The water quality that they pull out, if it's better than the Nelson, then it costs less to treat. And if they run the treatment plant for 25 years, 50 years of mining, at the end of the day, maybe that treatment plant can get turned back over to the state to be managed, and it's already in place. So that's just kind of, please don't, it's not me that's making these calls. I'm just providing information. But I think it's important to just to let you know, like, the discussions that people are trying to have, and the different options, and the fact that it's a money question at the end of the day. What can we do?
Rory, how expensive is that carbon dating, the water carbon dating process?
One sample of radiocarbon dating. One sample. DIC samples go to a Woods Hole lab. They cost $500 a sample. The DOC, I'm developing the technique at my lab, and we're talking $600 to $800 a sample right now. It's a multi-step process. You have to strip the carbon out of the water and then do the radiocarbon dating on it. So it's pretty expensive. Tritium's on the order of $200 to sample, and O18, the oxygen isotopes, are only $20 a sample. So that gives you an idea of the range and costs that you can get in sample size. So radiocarbon dating, if you have if you get 10 samples, you're pretty lucky because it's expensive.
Lynn Padgett, you're talking about scientific aspect. Can we get into the Good Samaritan thing? It's really what do you expect we're ever going to come out of this? If we can't really do Good Samaritan work, it doesn't matter what the water quality is, we're never going to be able to do anything about it.
Well, I think that...
Where do you want us to go?
Well, obviously, I want us to get a resolution. I want us to get to the point where the Clean Water Act is not a barrier to cleaner water, and unintentionally. And there's a balance where just morally, part of our country feels that those who are responsible for damage to water, for pollution, should have to clean it up at their own expense. And so there is a fear by, let's just say, environmental community that some polluters will be able to get off scot-free, and they don't want that. Now, on the other spectrum, we have the situation that we know, which is that there's no responsible party for pollution that happened pre-law.
so before the 1970s, essentially, before we knew better, before we had modern practices, and so on. And so we're stuck with not wanting real polluters to get off scot-free and have to clean up messes in the modern era, but what do we do with these legacy things? And so personally, I see that there have been people who have been on this issue since the Clean Water Act was passed in the early 1970s, and they're retiring and they're getting worn out. And so I'm hoping that by bringing more momentum from maybe a younger generation to continue pushing on this issue, that we can actually get resolution. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the EPA actually released a new initiative last year. That's pretty good. And then they released an initiative in 2007, which is also some movement, although the 2007 issue didn't go far enough. So we just keep zeroing in on where is it that we can go. If there was a way to get legislation that was very, very narrow, where all of our legislators agreed from the onset that we are not going to throw spaghetti on this particular legislation and put all of our pet projects on it, that we can really have an honor system, to have targeted, narrow, specific legislation to fix this, then we could get somewhere tomorrow. But the way that Washington, D.C. seems to work is once you get a ball rolling, there's an amendment, an amendment, an amendment, and that's where all sides on the whole continuum get very, very nervous. Everybody wants their thing. And so we're stuck in the middle with situations where we know we could take a significant amount of zinc out of the water, but we can't because we don't want to have that liability. So I hope I'm sort of answering your question. I'm just going to keep personally crusading on this, and I know both our senators are very interested in it. I know we have Colorado congressman that's interested in it. I think the approach right now is to continue to push on the EPA and get them to say what they can do under their current authority. And there are people who believe that they, under the current EPA authority, could allow Good Samaritans to not have liability. Now there are others who don't. So let's get the EPA to definitively say what they have the authority to do for Good Samaritans. And if that's not enough, let's try really hard to get narrow legislation to fix it. And let's try and do it in the next couple of years.
I've been working on Good Sam stuff for 25 years, so I'm one of these older people who kind of burned out on it, and I'm very glad to see that we have some new people picking up the torch. But what we've heard lately from some folks at EPA is that with the way things are in Congress, we're not going to see any legislation in this session, and probably not the next session after that either. And then hopefully, they can't see that far ahead. So we just have to keep trying to figure out ways around and how to move forward. What it might take, though, because of some of the recent court laws, is more people's ox getting gored. And what I'm talking about is Appalachia and some of the coal regions where they have acid mine drainage from coal mines, and they've already built very large passive mine drainage treatment systems using OSM dollars back there. And those are all passive systems that a watershed group is maintaining, and they don't all meet a Clean Water Act definition of the return. So they're partial treatment systems, and they've all been operating under state laws. And what could happen in the next few years is that another environmental group pushes too hard and sues a local watershed or one of these types of coal mine reclamation things, and forces the issue to come to a head where Good Samaritans and states and whatever that have made tremendous improvements in streams, brought back miles more fish and habitat, are now being forced to build some sort of a active treatment plant. And I think at that point, when that comes to a head, that's going to get everybody's attention to try to, that's when I think the legislation would happen, because frankly, states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, they have a lot more senators, a lot more representatives than we do in Colorado and the western states. We just don't have a big enough voice. If the eastern states are thrown under the bus in one of these lawsuits where it really gets everybody's attention, only then I think will Congress realize we got to fix this loophole. And there'll be a lot more concentration on it. So that's what might have to happen to really get the legislation.
Now, I'm getting detail here. We're talking about Good Samaritans deliberately, willfully going below a mine or on a mine for this issue. Well, what if somebody is clear downstream, having nothing to do with any mine in particular, just particularly wants to mine the water with no thought of, clearing the water for EPA or anybody else? I mean, there's plenty of stuff you can find here and there, but if you're not specifically involved in a water cleanup project for a specific mine, and you were just downstream from 500 of these things, and you have no responsibility, and you don't intend to be a Good Samaritan, you're just doing this for profit. Are you involved in that Good Samaritan issue?
So you're talking about somebody who is voluntarily treating a stream or a creek to get these metals out of it and sell the metals?
Has nothing to do with any particular mine or anything?
Yeah, I mean, that would fall under water law in Colorado about water rights and whether you can process it and how much consumptive use you had. And then obviously if you ran a treatment plant, you'd have to have some sort of NPDES or a permit to operate that plant and be very... The effluent limits of what you're doing would be, watch that. And I'm not sure if anybody would step forward to voluntarily, even if they could make a profit. There's a lot of strings attached to that type of scenario. Not that it might work on certain streams, but it's probably out of the realm of what we're really talking about here.
And I'll just add to it that with reclamation that's been going on, one of the strategies is trying to zero in on where is the worst water, where is the source, because it's more efficient to treat a lower flow volume with a higher concentration of metals than it is to treat or try and harvest. In your case, with the idea of mining the stuff from water, it's going to be much more expensive, I think, for someone to try and recover economically metals from a higher flow, like let's just say they're out in Grand Junction in the Colorado River versus at a portal where there's a lower flow, higher concentration, and it's more targeted. So I do wonder if that scenario, how attractive that scenario is.
I would just add too that the metals of concern when we think of acid mine drainage are probably different than the metals that we think of high value in mining. Gold and silver are not the metals that are polluting the streams, but they're the ones that would make you money. So I don't know if there's a market for cadmium on that scale, or in that sense. So that's another thing. A comment I wanted to make on the previous discussion, real quick, was the whole idea of targeted remediation that I'm talking about, getting at the source instead of treating it after it comes through a mine. It's kind of a new approach, and I think it goes to show that the EPA is trying to make strides to not just band-aid something by putting a treatment plant in. So a treatment plant, and it comes back to the cost. $500 sample sounds expensive, but a $20,000 hydrological investigation study is a lot less than a multi-million-dollar treatment plant that costs $1 million a year to run. And so you could do a lot of hydrologic studying, and the more you know, if you can reduce even 10% of the volume of water, you've cut down your cost. So that's another point of why you want to target where these flows are, how they get diluted, and where they mix together. I work on another project in Rico, Colorado, and it's kind of the opposite, where most of the water is new, young, clean water coming in, and there's not a lot of old water. In that case, we may be able to take a 900 gallon a minute outflow, and only 100 gallon per minute of that is actually mine drainage that goes into a drainage tunnel that has 700 gallons a minute of clean groundwater. But as soon as it mixes, you've got to treat it all. So if you can stop it before it does that, that plays into this whole cost decision making and remediation.
I have a two-part question regarding revegetation of reclaimed tailings or hill slopes. And one is, how do you select the species of vegetation that you're going to reseed with? And then two, is there any evidence of bioaccumulations of the toxins or contaminants? And does that propagate into wildlife or anything that utilizes that vegetation?
I can speak for the peanut mine site. As Ann mentioned, we had a lot of the local population really involved in selecting those plants, based not only on like ecology principles, but also based on just kind of local lore and what people preferred in that area. So selecting all native and then utilizing trees and plants with larger root structures in really steep areas for erosion control. And in terms of animals and wildlife, we haven't had any issues and have looked into that. We have cattle coming onto our property fairly regularly, and obviously they can't distinguish between the cell area and any other area. And so far we don't know of any issues with that in the revegetated areas.
And Kerber Creek watershed, a couple of things. I can't speak too much to our seed mix. It's mostly native grasses, and I believe some are a little bit more metals tolerant because of the method that we use. The method that we use doesn't remove any of the metals, it just binds them to organic so that they're no longer bioavailable. That kind of gets to the bioavailability issue. Most of those lands are grazed by the landowners, they're fairly flat, and I don't think there's been any problem in terms of bioaccumulation, and I think we've had pretty good success in terms of keeping the metals where they're supposed to be bound in those organics so that they're not available.
I like to watch science shows on TV, and last week there was a show on the History Channel called How the Earth Was Made, and it was this theory that there's very, very deep subduction of ocean bottom crust underneath where the volcanoes are, and that's why the water is really, really old and has never been to the surface except that it was in the ocean, and that's why the volcanoes have so much steam. And I guess I'm asking, is there salt in that old water?
The water is very salty.
Uh-huh.
Salts, but it's not necessarily prehistoric ocean water. Yes, water is generally salty. In mineralized areas, you're going to pick up a lot of salts. So whether or not the transition of the level of saltiness from where it comes in. But in this mining situation I'm talking about, we're talking about flow paths that are between the surface and maybe several hundred meters below. I'm not talking about even potential of water that's miles deep coming to the surface. So we're not talking about geothermal water in the sense of, think of hot springs, right? Hot springs come out at 100 degrees Celsius, right? Or not 100, but a lot warmer than this mine water is at 18 degrees. So it's not, we're not necessarily talking about mixing with fluids that are that deep. And I know it seems like time scales, you're like, okay, 10,000 years old water, but you can back out that it would take 10,000 years for the water to move through from the Continental Divide to the Rio Grande and Crete, for example. I mean, that's not unrealistic. So.
I'll just check. I was going to say I taught physical geology a long time ago. There are certain elements in the earth that are very, very common: potassium and sodium, and oxygen and iron, and so on. And also with subduction of ocean crust, that's the heaviest kind of plate. It's got basalt, and it's very, very heavy. So if you were going to have a subduction zone that had part continent and part ocean, the ocean is always going to go down because it's heavier. And the continental crust is going to sort of float over that ocean. And as far as lava goes, there's a lot of different things that play into the chemistry of lava. And one of them is how deep is the source and what is it erupting through. And you're going to have a very different eruption through a continental crest than through a more basaltic ocean regime. And sometimes you can have interplays between the two, or a whole range, a whole continuum. So I just want to caution against overgeneralization.
This is probably for Bruce. It's more a historical question. Why are there two tunnels, the Commodore number 5 and the Nelson, which are 2 to 3 miles long, only 40 feet apart in elevation? It seems like a tremendous waste of time and money to drive two tunnels like that.
Well, the answer is there were two different companies vying for the businesses of multiple mines along that vein. The Amethyst and the Commodore tunnel that runs along the vein was continued through time. That was the first one, and it was an upper level tunnel. Well, there was a company that came in and sold shares and stock in a tunnel and drainage company, and that's the Nelson tunnel. So they actually didn't own any of the mines or do any mining other than to drive their drainage tunnel. And then they sold the haulage and the drainage to all the other mines, the Happy Thought, what are all the other mines? The Amethyst. There was Bachelor. There's Park Regent. There was a number of large mines that were operating. And so these guys came in later and, just were selling this haulage to some of the other mines that had gotten so deep. So the Commodore tunnel was drilled first and belonged to certain mines owned by one owner, and all the other, he wasn't letting anybody else use it for their haulage, so that's why the guy ran in right underneath him, and it was a competition type thing to supply that infrastructure to the other mines as they went deeper and deeper down.
An interesting thing about the Nelson Tunnel, if you saw on the map, there's a section of it that makes this big jog. It goes to the east and then comes back. The Commodore goes straight right through. The Nelson underneath it makes a jog of a couple hundred feet to one way and then back. And there's different reasons to move a tunnel around. One might be that you need to move over to another area where there's storage. So they need to move the line over so that they can have storage area to set the next line. Another option is the quality of the rock degrades so bad that they can't put a tunnel in. It just starts crumbling on them. So that jog lines up with the Berkshire shaft, which all lines up to where we think some of this water's upwelling. So that's another reason, information from that tunnel and the placement of it that could relate to the inflow. So they could have had to move.
Rory, speaking to the time portion of it, how fast does the water move through the workings of the mine?
Through the workings of the mine themselves.
Yes.
Fairly rapidly. So they've done tracer studies where they put a guy in at the top, out to the bottom, and it moves within hours to different sections that you can sample. So it's moving right along, and it's a flat tunnel, it's a little bit of a grade, but it's a pretty open pathway. But there's a bunch of collapses along that tunnel now, and there's mine pools built up behind these because this tunnel's at the bottom. You can imagine everything's above it. That stuff collapses and it plugs that tunnel up. So along the way, there's these blockages, and then the water pools up behind it and pools up behind it. So it's not free flowing because of these pools, but the rate that it's moving downhill is relative to how fast it can move through these rubble piles. But otherwise, it's fairly quick moving in sections where it's open. We're not talking like years for the water to go from the back to the front, generally speaking, but what's unknown is if you have a pool of water, that there could be a cavern that goes down 100 feet off to the side of this tunnel. If that's full of water, the water in there may not be moving at the same speed as the water through the tunnel. So there is different storage areas that could have different times. And that affects a lot of things, like the amount of metal. The exposure to that water in another cavern can relate to the picking up of the metals.
We have time for one more question. If anyone
The original mining companies didn't care about this, but is there any evidence now
in water runoff or gravel, whatever, of rare earth formations, findings, deposits?
I think we have a talk actually later on today about rare earth occurrences in Colorado. There's certainly quite a few areas in different mining districts in the state of Colorado where there are known rare earth resources. I know there's some down here in the San Juans, tellurium, and some others, things like that. Actually, there's even some down around the Spanish Peaks and some of those basaltic dikes. There's some good publications that are put out by the Colorado Geological Survey that talk about some of the strategic minerals, if you will, tungsten and beryllium, and those sorts of things have been found, and there are deposits in Colorado. So you can find out a lot more information on where those are, where they are. I mean, just up the road here at Powderhorn, for instance, is I believe a big titanium rare earth, a very different geology that's one of the largest ones that's known in the United States, for instance.
And on that note, we have a talk about that given by Bob Larson later this evening or today. So if you have more questions on it, I'm sure he'll be able to answer. Are there any other questions? Okay. Otherwise, okay.
Yeah. Well, as a chemist, whenever somebody says heavy metals to me, I'm thinking platinum, I'm thinking uranium, I'm thinking atomic weight heavy. But I'm hearing things like zinc, cadmium, aluminum, lighter weight stuff to my mind. So I would like to know, what are the toxic metals that you consider heavy metals? Give me a list.
It's a mixed term. The term heavy metals, as far as water quality, most of the metals that we're talking about are zinc, cadmium, copper, iron, aluminum. Some of the common constituents of rock, and then sulfide ore minerals. So those are most of lead as well too. But it's just the terminology when you're talking about water with usually that doesn't have metals in it. That's where that term heavy comes in. So it's not the same term that like a physicist would use for some of the really heavy stuff like uranium and thorium and some of those other types of things.
Thank you, panel. That was wonderful. I hope all your questions are answered.